What's up? Welcome to Journey in the Self. I'm your host, Sarah, and tonight we're going to delve into part three of our series of discussions on the historical nature of the conflict in the so-called Middle East, Palestine and Israel. Since the last show, I've done some additional research. This series could probably go on for maybe 50 more sessions based upon the information that I have, but we're going to do our best to summarize and bring to light the most salient information that is relevant. And just to, I guess, review as to the significance and why we're doing this series is to basically illuminate, for those who don't know, the rationale behind what is going on, so that we can have a better understanding of the nature of the conflict and the why behind it, and why that conflict has gone on for so long. Most of you know that, as the show is titled Journey into Self, we spend a lot of our time on spiritual topics. And so you may ask, well, why are you discussing this on the spiritual show, Sarah? Well, the answer to that is spirituality is not an escape from life. And part of what we as spiritual people are charged with is standing up to injustice, to have the courage to stand up against injustice, to fight against injustice. And so what we're doing is to point out injustice. It's not something where there's any ill will towards any group of people, but it's just to call out injustice where it is, regardless of who is involved. And so we will resist any attempts to label this as anti anyone or anything. And that is why we are coming armed with the facts. Too often, the strategy and tactic that is employed to dissuade people from discussing facts is by attaching some type of label, engaging in personal attacks, and that's only a response in fear and cowardice, because those who do so realize that they cannot refute the facts. So we're standing on the square, as it were, and our objective is to discuss and identify and find the truth. For it is the truth that will set us free. Ashe. So I want to, and bear with me because there's just so much information, and I didn't have time to really organize what we want to discuss tonight. So bear with me as I jump around from different books. And but I'm going to present this information in the best order possible, and so just bear with me as we go through it. Okay, so when we did our last show, we were reading in a good degree of detail from the book Facts Are Facts, written by Benjamin H. Friedman, who describes himself as a former Jew. He disavowed Jewishness, and he would put the word Jew in quotes, and he would refer to it and has referred to it as the term is so-called Jew because he is very well aware of that history, and we will spend some time reviewing the term Jew and illuminating why it is that he disavows being part of that and also disavows the term. We would also listen to some excerpts of the speech that he gave, which does actually form a lot of the body of this book that we're reading from. Okay, so I'm going to pick up from the book Facts Are Facts, and this may be a bit of a review because I believe I did read some of this part, but I think it bears repeating because these are some very important points. Okay, so we're reading from page 26 of the book Facts Are Facts by Benjamin H. Friedman, and I'm starting from let's see. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and start from page 25. Okay, he says, Christians today are also becoming more and more alerted day by day why the so-called or self-styled Jews throughout the world for 3 centuries have spent uncounted sums of money to manufacture the fiction that the Judeans in the time of Jesus were Jews rather than Judeans, and that Jesus was a Jew. Christians are becoming more and more aware day by day of all the economic and political advantages accruing to the so-called or self-styled Jew as a direct result of their success in making Christians believe that Jesus was a Jew, in the secondary meaning they have created for the 18th century word Jew. The so-called or self-styled Jews throughout the world today represent themselves to Christians as Jews only in the secondary meaning of the word Jew. They seek to thereby prove their kinship with Jesus. They emphasize this fiction to Christians constantly. That fable is fast fading and losing its former grip upon the imaginations of Christians. To allege that Jesus was a Jew in the sense that during his lifetime Jesus professed and practiced the form of religious worship known and practiced under the name of Judaism is false and fiction of the most blasphemous nature. If to be called a so-called or self-styled Jew then or now, the practice of Judaism was a requirement, then Jesus was certainly not a so-called Jew. Jesus abhorred and denounced the form of religious worship practiced in Judea in his lifetime, and which is known and practiced today under his new name, Judaism. That religious belief was then known as Pharisaism or Pharisaism. The Christian clergy learned that in their theological seminary days, but they have never made any attempt to make that clear to Christians. The eminent rabbi, Louis Finkelstein, the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary in America, often referred to as the Vatican of Judaism, in his foreword to his first edition of the world-famous classic, The Pharisees, the sociological background of their faith, on page 21 states, Judaism, Phariseeism became Talmudism. Talmudism became medieval rabbinism, and medieval rabbinism became modern rabbinism. But throughout these changes in name, the spirit of the ancient Pharisees survived unaltered. From Palestine to Babylonia, from Babylonia to North Africa, Italy, Spain, France, and Germany, from these to Poland, Russia, and Eastern Europe, generally, ancient Phariseeism has wandered, demonstrates the enduring importance which attached to Phariseeism as a religious movement. I think it was as a religious movement. The celebrated Rabbi Finkelstein, in his great classic, quoted from above, traces the origin of the form of religious worship practiced today under the present name Judaism to its origin as Phariseeism in Judea in the time of Jesus. Rabbi Louis Finkelstein confirms what the eminent Rabbi Adolf Moses states in his great classic Yahvism and Other Discourses, in collaboration with the celebrated Rabbi H.G. Enlau, published in 1903 by the Louisville section of the Council of Jewish Women, in which Rabbi Adolf Moses on page 1 states, among the innumerable misfortunes which have befallen the most faithful in its consequences is the name Judaism. Worse still, the Jews themselves, who have gradually come to call their religion Judaism, yet neither in biblical or post-biblical, neither in Talmudic, nor in much later times, is the term Judaism ever heard. The Bible speaks of the religion as Torah Yahweh, the instruction or the moral law revealed by Yahweh in other places, as Yirah Yahweh, the fear and reverence of Yahweh. Okay, so I want to go back to the statement that Benjamin Friedman made at the probably in the midpoint in this section that I just discussed, where he says Jesus abhorred and denounced the form of religious worship practiced in Judea in his lifetime, which is known and practiced today under its new name, Judaism, and that religious belief was then known as Pharisaism. So to underscore that point that he made, I wish to go to the New Testament in Matthew 23:14, where Jesus is saying, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer, therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation." So that statement there in the New Testament validates Benjamin Friedman's point that Jesus himself abhorred and denounced that form of religion to religious worship that has come down to us under the name as Judaism, which the Rabbi Louis Finkelstein said was actually Phariseeism. Okay. I want to move on. In the book, Facts Are Facts, where it says, this statement by the world's two leading authorities on the subject clearly establishes beyond any question or any doubt that so-called Judaism was not the name of any form of religious worship practiced in Judea at the time of Jesus. Flavius Josephus, who lived in the first century, it was he who coined the word Judaism in the first century, explicitly for the purpose recited clearly above. Religious worship known and practiced today under the name Judaism by so-called self-styled Jews throughout the world was known and practiced in Judea at the time of Jesus under the name Phariseeism. And it says the form of religious worship known as Phariseeism in Judea in the time of Jesus was a religious practice based exclusively upon the Talmud. Okay. Now, the Talmud, as I have come to understand, were basically two volumes. One referred to as the Babylonian Talmud, which was, according to my research, put together in and around 458 BC in Babylon, and another was called the Jerusalem Talmud, or Talmud. Okay, and so the Talmud was basically the interpretation by the Judah priesthood, which I believe were referred to as the Levite priests. They codified the Torah and refined the Torah into laws. And as I have come to read or learn from my reading, was that both some of the Torah and the Talmud were written contemporaneously, meaning they were written at the same time. In fact, the Talmud, which is, the Torah, which is essentially the first 5 books of the Old Testament, according to my research, was basically an amalgamation or synthesis of writings, spiritual teachings that had already pre-existed, as documented by our Kemetic scholars such as Dr. Ben, Dr. John Henry Clark, Brother Asher Kwesi, that these were extracted. Some of the teachings were extracted from the Kemetic mystery system. They've documented that the 10 Commandments were taken from the 42 Confessions of Innocence. Okay, and so some of the spiritual teachings that had already pre-existed, which were spiritual teachings that established the oneness of humanity, that venerated a universal God, and the objective of the spiritual teachings were to unite man with God. As we talked about in previous spiritual talks, we revealed that the true meaning of the word religion is to unite us with God, to re-yoke, to rebind together. That's the true meaning of religion. Okay, and so those religions pre-existed the Torah or the Old Testament, but when the Pharisees or the Levite priests began to compile the Torah, they ended up taking what existed before to make it palatable, but then to weave in their own uh, objectives and their own laws, and to basically even take liberties with and even redirect the teachings and some of the things that had already been written by or transcribed by uh, prior spiritual teachers. And as we have seen again, were recorded, some of which existed in the papyri and in the temples in Kemet. Okay, and so thus, when one reads the Torah, you at first find a God who is loving, merciful, and is no respecter of persons, which then later ends up devolving into a jealous, angry, vengeful God who has a chosen people who he wants to separate and hold above others, which is inconsistent with any kind of spiritual teachings, true spiritual teachings that have existed before and exist now. Okay. So I'll go on to read a bit more. Just bear with me for a second. Okay. The form of religious worship known as Pharisaism in Judea in the time of Jesus was a religious practice based exclusively upon the Talmud. The Talmud in the time of Jesus was the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all rolled into one of those who practice Pharisaism. The Talmud today occupies the same relative position with respect to those who profess Judaism. The Talmud today virtually exercises totalitarian dictatorship over the lives of so-called or self-styled Jews, whether they are aware of the fact or not. Their spiritual leaders make no attempt to conceal the control they exercise over the lives of so-called or self-styled Jews. They extend their authority far beyond the legitimate limits of spiritual matters. Their authority has no equal outside religion. And then it goes on to say the Talmud consists of 63 books of legal, ethical, and historical writings of the ancient rabbis. It was edited 5 centuries after the birth of Jesus. It is a compendium of law and love, according to this Rabbi Morris N. Ketzer. It is a legal code which forms the basis of religious law, and it is the textbook used in the training of rabbis. In his History of the Talmud, Michael Rodkinson on page 70 writes, is the literature that Jesus was familiar with in his early years yet in existence in the world? Is it possible for us to get at it? Can we ourselves review the ideas, the statements, the modes of reasoning or thinking, or moral and religious subjects which were current in his time and must have been evolved by him during those 30 silent years when he was pondering the future mission? To such inquiries, the learned class of Jewish rabbis answered by holding up the Talmud. Here, they say, is the source from whence Jesus of Nazareth drew the teachings which enabled him to revolutionize the world, and the question becomes, therefore, an interesting one to every Christian. What is the Talmud? The Talmud, then, is the written form of that which in the time of Jesus was called the traditions of the elders, and to which he makes frequent allusions. What type of book is it? But it says that the original 63 books of the Talmud were first composed by the authors in many lands between 200 BC and 500 AD. Okay, so 500 AD stands for Anno Domini, or after the death of Jesus. So how could then Jesus have been teaching of the Talmud, which didn't exist until 500 years after his death? Okay, so I'm going to stop reading for now from the book Facts Are Facts. And part of the reason I wish to stop reading from this book at this point is that what follows at this point is a number of excerpts from the Talmud, which are very difficult to digest, very difficult to read, very difficult to be able to reconcile with spiritual teachings. I'll just leave it there. Okay, so I want to skip on to another book that I've been reading called The Controversy of Zion, written by Douglas Reed. And his book is pretty, well, pretty is actually not the appropriate term. It is very, very well detailed and documented. And bear with me as we go through this one. There's a lot of information in this book. And so here in the first chapter, he points out that what he refers to as the controversy of Zion began back as far as 458 BC, when the Palestinian tribe of Judah, which he calls the, I don't know if I would call it Palestinian, because Palestine didn't exist at that time, but we'll just suffice to say that the land, which actually was Canaan, which he does acknowledge, but there was a tribe then called the tribe of Judah, and the East describes them as a small tribe of people who in 458 BC produced what he referred to as a racial creed, which he found to be disruptive um, on human affairs, and points out that it continues to be disruptive. They said it was disowned by the Israelites, and that the creed that they created was a racial creed that sets up the theory of a master race established based upon the law, or the Torah, or the Talmud. And he says that the creed born in Judah 2,500 years ago, in the author's opinion, has chiefly brought this about. The process from original cause to present effect can be clearly traced because the period is, in the main, one of verifiable history. He says the creed, which a fanatical sect produced in that day, has shown a great power over the minds of men throughout these 25 centuries, hence its destructive achievement. Why it was born at that particular moment, or ever, is something that none can explain. This is one of the greatest mysteries of our world, and thus the theory that every action produces an equal and opposite action is valid in the areas of religious thought, so that an impulse which at that remote time set many men searching for a universal loving God produced this fierce counter idea of an exclusive vengeful deity. He says Judaism was retrogressive even at 458 BC, when men in the known world were beginning to turn their eyes away from idols and tribal gods and to look for a God of all men, of justice, and of neighborliness. And Confucius and Buddha already pointed in that direction, and the idea of one God was known amongst the neighboring peoples of Judah. Today the claim is often made that a religious man, Christian, Muslim, or other, must pay respect to Judaism, whatever its areas, on one incontestable ground: it was the first universal religion, so that in a sense all universal religions descend from it. Every Jewish child is taught that, but in truth, the idea of one God of all men was known long before the tribe of Judah even took shape, and Judaism was above all else the denial of that idea. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, manuscripts of which were found in the tombs of kings 2600 BC, we know it was longer than that, over 2,000 years before the Judaist law was completed, contains the passage, "Thou art the one, the God from the very beginning of time, the heir of immortality, self-produced, self-born. Thou didst create the earth and make man." Conversely, the scripture produced in Judah, the Levites asked, "Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods?" Okay, I'm going to stop to again make the observation that there has never been, other than what he's saying here about Judaism, there's never been a polytheistic religion, ever. Or at least not amongst any indigenous people. As he pointed out here, that the ancient Egyptian or Kemetic religion, despite the fact that it has been considered as polytheistic because they have many gods, but those gods represent different aspects of the one God. The same holds true to other religions, such as the Sanatana Dharma, which is now called Hinduism, and other African gods. The gods only represent aspects of the one God. There's never been a polytheistic religion. Okay. So he points out here in 458, 458 BC that the Judahites, basically with their priests, basically codified a law and religion that set them apart from humanity, established a theory of them being chosen people, defined laws that they would have to uphold, which they said were ascribed to God, were God's commandments and laws given to them, when those were actually laws that were created by the Levite priests, which again is why uh, Jesus abhorred those teachings, because he knew that they basically made these things up. Okay, and so um, I'm going to go into more detail in this book kind of later time, but I want to basically lay the groundwork for this, because we're going to go into basically how this um, how they went about establishing this creed. But I want to make it clear that those people in Judah, the Judahites and the Israelites, were not the people even then. Were not the people who are now currently in occupying uh, Palestine and established a statehood there, even though they adopted this creed. As we discussed, when the Khazar people in approximately 740 AD converted to this religion that had been established and began codification in Babylon in 458 BC. Okay, and so we want to make clear that this was a creed of separation, where these people were, along with their priests, were creating these laws and codes that they would live by, which they began to ascribe to a to their God, and then they taught these laws to their people, their followers, and they conducted themselves accordingly. These ended up justifying things like going into the land of Canaan and uh, utterly destroying the land, um, killing everything and everyone in sight, save women and children, maybe, and I won't even go into what they said that they would do with the women and children. Um, and that so they defined this code, which ended up being amalgamated in terms of the Torah, which, as I said, were intertwined with existing teachings, spiritual teachings, to make it, to legitimize it, but then subtly began to change it to fit their objectives of uh, establishing uh, their own superiority and codifying the way that they would conduct themselves with each other and with other people. And then progresses on to um, this spreading amongst their people, culminating in 740 AD, where the king of the Khazars, seeking recognition as a political, military, and economic power into their own right, looking to be independent of the Roman Catholic Church and the uh, Caliphate, the Muslim Caliphate, decided to adopt a religion that was independent of both of those, choosing what is now known as Judaism, which we've established as Phariseeism, along with those laws and codes that were codified in 458 BC, which then, after they converted, the fall of the Khazars, those people dispersed throughout Europe, particularly concentrating in the lands near Khazar, which includes the Ukraine, and then Russia, and later Germany. But those Khazar people are described as Turkish people. Okay, and so these are distinct from those people who originally created the Phariseeism, which then came down contemporaneously to us as Judaism. Okay, so I'm going to stop there from the book Controversy of Zion, and we're going to go back and listen to some excerpts from the speech given to the author of the book, Facts Are Facts, Benjamin Friedman, who was given an address to, I believe it was the military, or some select groups of military patriots, where he was basically telling, his story about what he knew. Now, just for review, we're just going to give a little bit of background about, again, for a little background of who Benjamin Friedman was. Okay, so Benjamin Friedman was one of the most intriguing and amazing individuals of the 20th century. Mr. Friedman, born in 1890, was a successful Jewish businessman of New York City who at one time was the principal owner of the Woodbury Soap Company. He broke with organized Jewry after the Judeo-Communist victory of 1945 and spent the remainder of his life in his great preponderance of his considerable fortune of at least $2.5 million, exposing the Jewish tyranny which had enveloped the United States. Mr. Friedman knew of what he was talking because he had been an insider at the highest levels of Jewish organizations and Jewish machinations to gain power over our nation. Mr. Friedman was personally acquainted with Bernard Baruch, Samuel Untermeyer, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy, and many more movers and shakers of our time. This speech was given before a patriotic audience in 1961 at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., on behalf of Con McGinley's patriotic newspaper of that time, Common Sense. Brother Jamal, would you go ahead and play the clip from Benjamin Freedman's speech?
The speaker is Mr. Benjamin Freedman, noted authority on Zionism and all of its schemes. Mr. Freedman is a former Jew, and I mean a former Jew. He has fought the communist world conspiracy tooth and nail and stands today as a leading American patriot. We now take you to the speaker's platform to present Benjamin Freedman.
What I intend to tell you tonight is something that you have never been able to learn from any other source. And what I tell you now concerns not only you, but your children and the survival of this country and Christianity. I'm not here just to dish up a few facts to send up your blood pressure, but I'm here to tell you things that will help you preserve what you consider the most sacred thing in the world, the liberty and the freedom and the right to live as Christians, where you have a little dignity and a little right to pursue the things that your conscience tells you are the right thing as Christians. Now, first of all, I'd like to tell you that on August 25th, 1960, that was shortly before election, Senator Kennedy, who is now the President of the United States, went to New York and delivered an address to the Zionist Organization of America. In that address, to reduce it to its briefest form, he stated that he would use the armed forces of the United States to preserve the existence of the regime set up in Palestine by the Zionists, who are now in occupation of that area. In other words, Christian boys are going to be yanked out of their homes, away from their families, and sent abroad to fight in Palestine against the Christian and Muslim Arabs who merely want to return to their homes. And these Christian boys are going to be asked to shoot to kill these innocent people who only want to follow out 15 resolutions passed by United Nations in the last 12 years, calling upon the Zionists to allow these people to return to their homes. Now, when the United States troops appear in the Middle East to fight with the Zionists as their allies to prevent the return of these people who were evicted from their homes in the 1948 armed insurrection by the Zionists who were transplanted there from Eastern Europe, when that happens, the United States will trigger World War III. You say, when will that take place? The answer is, as soon as the difficulties between France and Algeria have been settled, that will take place. As soon as France and Algeria have settled their difficulties and the Arab world or the Muslim world have no more war on their hands with France, they are going to move these people back into their homes. And when they do that, and President Kennedy sends your sons to fight over there to help the crooks hold on to what they stole from innocent men, women, and children, we will trigger World War III. And when that starts, you can be sure we cannot emerge from that war a victor. We are going to lose that war because there is not one nation in the world that will let one of their sons fight with us for such a cause. I know and speak to these ambassadors in Washington and at United Nations, and of the 99 nations there, I've consulted with maybe 70 of them, and when we go to war in Palestine to help the thieves retain possession of what they have stolen from these innocent people, we're not going to have a man there to fight with us as our allies. And who will these people have supporting them, you ask? Well, 4 days after President Kennedy, or he was then Senator Kennedy, made that statement, on August 28, 1960, the Arab nations called a meeting in Lebanon, and there they decided to resurrect or reactivate the government of Palestine, which has been dormant more or less since the 1948 armed insurrection by the Zionists. Not alone that, they ordered the creation of a Palestinian army, and there are now drilling maybe 500,000 soldiers in that area of the world to lead these people back to their homes. With them, they have as their allies all the nations of what is termed the Bandung Conference group. That includes the Soviet Union and every Soviet Union satellite. It includes Red China. It includes every independent country in Asia and Africa, or 80% of the world's total population. 80% of the world's population, 4 out of 5 human beings on the face of the earth, will be our enemies at war with us. Not alone are they 4 out of 5 human beings now on the face of this earth, but they are the non-Christian population of the world, and they are the non-Caucasian, the non-white nations of the world. And that's what we face. And what is the reason? The reason is that here in the United States, the Zionists and their co-religionists have complete control of our government. For many reasons, too many and too complex to go in here at this time. I'll be glad to answer questions, however, to support that statement. The Zionists and their co-religionists rule this United States as though they were the absolute monarchs of this country. Now you say, well, that's a very broad statement to make, but let me show what happened while you were, I don't want to wear that out. Let me show you what happened while we were all asleep. I'm including myself with you. We were all asleep. What happened? World War I broke out in the summer of 1914. 1914 was the year in which World War I broke out. There are a few people here my age who remember that. Now, that war was waged on one side by Great Britain, France, and Russia, and on the other side by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. What happened? Within 2 years, Germany had won that war. Not alone won it nominally, but won it actually. The German submarines, which were a surprise to the world, had swept all the convoys from the Atlantic Ocean, and Great Britain stood there without ammunition for her soldiers, stood there with 1 week's food supply facing her, and after that, starvation. At that time, the French army had mutinied. They lost 600,000 of the flower of the French youth in the defense of Verdun on the Somme. The Russian army was defecting. They were picking up their toys and going home. They didn't want to play war anymore. They didn't like the Tsar. And the Italian army had collapsed. Now, Germany, not a shot had been fired on the German soil. Not an enemy soldier had crossed the border into Germany. And yet, here was Germany offering England peace terms. They offered England a negotiated peace on what the lawyers call a status quo ante basis. That means, let's call the war off and let everything be as it was before the war started. Well, England in the summer of 1916 was considering that. seriously. They had no choice. It was either accepting this negotiated peace that Germany was magnanimously offering them, or going on with the war and being totally defeated. While that was going on, the Zionists in Germany, who represented the Zionists from Eastern Europe, went to the British War Cabinet, and I'm going to be brief because this is a long story, but I have all the documents to prove any statement that I make if anyone here is curious or doesn't believe what I'm saying is at all possible. The Zionists in London went to the British War Cabinet and they said, look here, you can yet win this war. You don't have to give up. You don't have to accept a negotiated peace offered to you now by Germany. You can win this war if the United States will come in as your ally. The United States was not in the war at that time. We were fresh, we were young, we were rich, we were powerful, and they told England, we will guarantee to bring the United States into the war as your ally, to fight with you on your side, if you will promise us Palestine after you win the war. In other words, they made this deal. We will get the United States into this war as your ally. The price you must pay us is Palestine after you have won the war and defeated Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. Now, England had as much right to promise Palestine to anybody as the United States would have to promise Japan to Ireland for any reason whatsoever. It's absolutely absurd that Great Britain, that never had any connection or any interest or any right in what is known as Palestine, should offer it as coin of the realm to pay the Zionists for bringing the United States into the war. However, they made that promise in October of 1916. October 1916. And shortly after that, I don't know how many here remember it, the United States, which was almost totally pro-German, because the newspapers here were controlled by Jews, the bankers were Jews, all the media of mass communications in this country were controlled by Jews, and they were pro-German because their people, in a majority of cases, came from Germany, and they wanted to see Germany lick the Tsar. The Jews didn't like the Tsar, and they didn't want Russia to win this war. So the German bankers, the German Jews, Kuhn Loeb, and the other big banking firms in the United States refused to finance France or England to the extent of $1. They stood aside and they said, as long as France and England are tied up with Russia, not 1 cent. But they poured money into Germany. They fought with Germany against Russia, trying to lick the Tsarist regime. Now, those same Jews, when they saw the possibility of getting Palestine, they went to England and they made this deal. At that time, everything changed, like the traffic light that changes from red to green, where the newspapers had been all pro-German, where they'd been telling the people the difficulties that Germany was having fighting Great Britain commercially and in other respects. All of a sudden, the Germans were no good. They were villains. They were Huns. They were shooting Red Cross nurses. They were cutting off babies' hands, and they were no good. Well, shortly after that, Mr. Wilson declared war on Germany. The Zionists in London sent these cables to the United States to Justice Brandeis, go to work on President Wilson. We're getting from England what we want. Now you go to work, and you go to work on President Wilson and get the United States into the war. And that did happen. That's how the United States got into the war. We had no more interest in it. We had no more right to be in it than we have to be on the moon tonight instead of in this room. Now, the war World War I, in which the United States participated, had absolutely no reason to be our war. We went in there, we were railroaded into it. If I can be vulgar, we were suckered into that war merely so that the Zionists of the world could obtain Palestine. Now, that is something that the people in the United States have never been told. They never knew why we went into World War I. Now, what happened? After we got into the war, the Zionists went to Great Britain and they said, well, we performed our part of the agreement. Let's have something in writing that shows that you are going to keep your bargain and give us Palestine after you win the war, because they didn't know whether the war would last another year or another 10 years. So they started to work out a receipt. The receipt took the form of a letter, and it was worded in very cryptic language so that the world at large wouldn't know what it was all about. And that was called the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was merely Great Britain's promise to pay the Zionists what they had agreed upon as a consideration for getting the United States into the war. So this great Balfour Declaration that you hear so much about is just as phony as a $3 bill, and I don't think I can make it more emphatic than that. Now, that is where all the trouble started. The United States was in the war. The United States crushed Germany. We went in there, and its history, you know what happened. Now, when the war was ended, and the Germans went to Paris, to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, there were 117 Jews there as a delegation representing the Jews, headed by Bernard Baruch. I was there, I ought to know. Now what happened? The Jews at that peace conference, when they were cutting up Germany and parceling out Europe to all these nations that claimed a right to a certain part of European territory, the Jews said, how about Palestine for us? And they produced, for the first time, to the knowledge of Germans, this Balfour Declaration. So the Germans, for the first time, realized, oh, that was the game. That's why the United States came into the war. And the Germans, for the first time, realized that they were defeated. They suffered this terrific reparations that was slapped onto them because the Zionists wanted Palestine, and they were determined to get it at any cost. Now that brings us up to another very interesting point. When the Germans realized this, they naturally resented it. Up to that time, the Jews had never been better off in any country in the world than they had been in Germany. You had Mr. Rosenau there, who was maybe 100 times as important in industry and finance as Bernard Baruch in this country. You had Mr. Ballin, who owned the two big steamship lines, the North German Lloyd and the Hamburg American line, thank you. You had Mr. Bleichsröder, who was the banker for the Hohenzollern family. You had the Warburgs in Hamburg, who were the big merchant bankers, the biggest in the world. The Jews were doing very well in Germany. No question about that. Now, the Germans felt, well, that was quite a sellout. It was a sellout that I can best compare. Suppose the United States was at war today with the Soviet Union, and we were winning, and we told the Soviet Union, well, let's quit. We offer you peace terms. Let's forget the whole thing. And all of a sudden, Red China came into the war as an ally of the Soviet Union, and throwing them into the war brought about our defeat. a crushing defeat, with the reparations the likes of which man's imagination cannot encompass. Imagine, then, after that defeat, if we found out that it was the Chinese in this country, our Chinese citizens, who all the time we thought they were loyal citizens working with us, was selling us out to the Soviet Union, and it was through them that Red China was brought into the war against us. How would we feel in the United States against Chinese? I don't think one of them would dare show his face on any street. There wouldn't be lampposts enough convenient to take care of them. Imagine how we would feel. Well, that's how the Germans felt towards these Jews. We've been so nice to them, and from 1905 on, when the first communist revolution in Russia failed and the Jews had to scramble out of Russia, they all went to Germany, and Germany gave them refuge, and they were treated very nicely. And here, they sold Germany down the river for no reason at all, other than they wanted Palestine as a so-called Jewish commonwealth. Now, Nahum, Sokolow, all the great leaders, the big names that you read about in connection with Zionism today, they, in 1919, 1920, 21, 22, and 23, they wrote in all their papers, and the press was filled with their statements, that the feeling against the Jews in Germany is due to the fact that they realized that this great defeat was brought about by our intercession and bringing the United States into the war against them. The Jews themselves admitted that. It wasn't that the Germans in 1919 discovered that a glass of Jewish blood tasted better than Coca-Cola or Münchner beer. There was no religious feeling. There was no sentiment against those people merely on account of their religious belief. It was all political. It was economic. It was anything but religion. Nobody cared in Germany whether a Jew went home and pulled down the shades and said Shema Yisrael or Our Father. No one cared in Germany any more than they do in the United States. Now, this feeling that developed later in Germany was due to one thing, that the Germans held the Jews responsible for their crushing defeat for no reason at all, because World War I was started against Germany for no reason for which they were responsible. They were guilty of nothing, only of being successful. They built up a big navy. They built up world trade. You must remember, Germany, at the time of Napoleon, at the time of the French Revolution, what was the German Reich consisted of 300 small city-states, principalities, dukedoms, and so forth. 300 little separate political entities. And between that time, between the period between Napoleon and Bismarck, they were consolidated into one state. And within 50 years after that time, they became one of the world's great powers. Their navy was rivaling Great Britain's. They were doing business all over the world. They could undersell anybody and make better products. And what happened? What happened as a result of that? There was a conspiracy between England, France, and Russia that we must slap down Germany, because there isn't one historian in the world that can find a valid reason why those three countries decided to wipe Germany off the map politically. Now, what happened after that? When Germany realized that the Jews were responsible for her defeat, they naturally resented it. But not a hair on the head of any Jew was harmed. Not a single hair. Professor Tanzel of Georgetown University, who had access to all the secret papers of the State Department, wrote in his book and quoted from a State Department document written by Hugo Schoenfeld, a Jew who Cordell Hull sent to Europe in 1933 to investigate the so-called camps of political prisoners. And he wrote back that he found them in very fine condition. They were in excellent shape. Everybody treated well, and they were filled with communists. Well, a lot of them were Jews, because the Jews happened to be maybe 98% of the communists in Europe at that time. And there were some priests there, and ministers, labor leaders, Masons, and others who had international affiliation. Now, the Jews sort of tried to keep the lid on this fact. They didn't want the world to really understand that they had sold out Germany and that the Germans resented that. So they did take appropriate action against them. They, shall I say, discriminated against them wherever they could. They shunned them, the same as we would the Chinese or the Negroes or the Catholics or anyone in this country that sold us out to an enemy and brought about our defeat. Now, after a while, the Jews of the world didn't know what to do, so they called a meeting in Amsterdam. Jews from every country in the world attended in July 1933, and they said to Germany, "You fire Hitler and you put every Jew back into his former position, whether he was a communist, no matter what he was. You can't treat us that way. And we, the Jews of the world, are calling upon you and serving this ultimatum upon you." Well, the Germans told them, you can imagine. So what did they do? They broke up. And Samuel Untermeyer, if the name means anything to people here, you want to ask a question?
There were no communists in Germany at that time. They were called Social Democrats.
Well, I don't want to go by what they were called. We're now using English words, and what they were called in Germany is not very material, but they were communists because in 1917, the communists took over Germany for a few days. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and a group of Jews in Germany took over the government for 3 days. In fact, when the Kaiser ended the war, he fled to Holland because he thought the communists were going to take over Germany as they did Russia, and that he was going to meet the same fate that the Tsar did in Russia. So he left and went to Holland for safety, for security. Now, at that time, when the communist threat in Germany was quashed, it was quiet, the Jews were working still, trying to get back into their former status, and the Germans fought them in every way they could without hurting a hair on anyone's head. The same as one group, the prohibitionists, fought the people who were interested in liquor, and they didn't fight one another with pistols. They did it every way they could. Well, that's the way they were fighting the Jews in Germany. And at that time, mind you, there were 80 to 90 million Germans, and there were only 460,000 Jews. Less than 1/2% of the population of Germany were Jews. And yet, they controlled all the press, they controlled most of the economy, because they had come in and with cheap money, you know the way the mark was devalued, they bought up practically everything. Well, in 1933, when Germany refused to surrender, mind you, to the World Conference of Jews in Amsterdam, they broke up, and Mr. Untermeyer came back to the United States, who was the head of the American delegation and the president of the whole conference, and he went from the steamer to ABC and made a radio broadcast throughout the United States in which he said, "The Jews of the world now declare a holy war against Germany. We are now engaged in a sacred conflict against the Germans, and we are going to starve them into surrender. We are going to use a worldwide boycott against them that will destroy them because they are dependent upon their export business. And it is a fact that 2/3 of Germany's food supply had to be imported, and it could only be imported with the proceeds of what they exported, their labor. So if Germany could not export, 2/3 of Germany's population would have to starve. There just was not enough food for more than 1/3 of a population. Now, in this declaration, which I have here, it was printed and a whole page, in the New York Times on August 7th, 1933, Mr. Samuel Untermeyer boldly stated that this economic boycott is our means of self-defense. President Roosevelt has advocated its use in the NRA, which some of you may remember, where everybody was to be boycotted unless they followed the rules laid down by the New Deal, which of course was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court at that time. Nevertheless, the Jews of the world declared a boycott against Germany, and it was so effective that you couldn't find one thing in any store anywhere in the world with the word "Made in Germany" on it. In fact, an executive of the Woolworth Company told me that they had to dump millions of dollars worth of crockery and dishes into the river, that their stores were boycotted. If anyone came in and found a dish marked "Made in Germany," they were picketed with signs, Hitler, murderer, and so forth, and like something like these sit-ins that are taking place in the South. R.H. Macy, which is controlled by a family called Strauss, who also happen to be Jews, a woman found stockings there, which came from Chemnitz, marked "Made in Germany." Well, they were cotton stockings. They may have been there 20 years, because since I've been observing women's legs in the last 20 years, I haven't seen a pair with cotton stockings on them. So Macy, I saw Macy boycotted with hundreds of people walking around with signs, "Murderers" and "Hitlerites" and so forth. Now, up to that time, not one hair of any Jew had been hurt in Germany. There was no suffering, there was no starvation, there was no murder, there was nothing. Now, that, naturally, the Germans said, why, who are these people to declare a boycott against us and throw all our people out of work and our industries come to a standstill? Who are they to do that to us? And they naturally resented it. Certainly they painted swastikas on stores owned by Jews. Why should a German go in and give their money to a storekeeper who is part of a boycott, who is going to starve Germany into surrender into the Jews of the world, who are going to dictate who their premier or chancellor was to be? Well, it was ridiculous. That continued for some time. And it wasn't until 1938 when a young Jew from Poland walked into the German embassy in Paris and shocked one of the officials that the Germans really started to get rough with the Jews in Germany. And you found them then breaking windows and having street fights and so forth. Now, for anyone to say that, I don't like to use the word anti-Semitism because it's meaningless, but it means something to you still, so I'll have to use it. The only reason that there was any feeling in Germany against Jews was that they were responsible, number one, for World War I, number two, for this worldwide boycott, and number three, did I say for World War I, they were responsible for the boycott, and also for World War II, because after this thing got out of hand, it was absolutely necessary for the Jews and Germany to lock horns in a war to see which one was going to survive. In the meanwhile, I had lived in Germany, and I knew that the Germans had decided Europe is going to be Christian or communist. There is no in-between. It's going to be Christian or it's going to be communist. And the Germans decided, we're going to keep it Christian if possible. And they started to rearm. And their intention was, by that time, the United States had recognized the Soviet Union, which they did in November 1933. The Soviet Union was becoming very powerful, and Germany realized, well, our turn is going to come soon unless we are strong. The same as we in this country are saying today, our turn is going to come soon unless we're strong, and our government is spending 83 or 84 billion dollars of your money for defense, they say. Defense against who? Defense against 40,000 little Jews in Moscow that took over Russia and then, in their devious ways, took over control of many other governments of the world. Now, for this country to now be on the verge of a third world war from which we cannot emerge a victor is something that staggers my imagination. I know that nuclear bombs are measured in terms of megabomb. A megabomb is a term used to describe 1 million tons of TNT. 1 million tons of TNT is a megabomb. Now, our nuclear bombs had a capacity of 10 megabombs, 10 million tons of TNT. That was when they were first developed 5 or 6 years ago. Now, the nuclear bombs that are being developed have a capacity of 200 megabombs. And God knows how many megabombs the nuclear bombs that the Soviet Union has have a capacity. So, what do we face now? If we trigger a world war that may develop into a nuclear war, humanity is finished. And why will it take place? It will take place because Act 3, the curtain goes up on Act 3. Act 1 was World War I. Act 2 was World War II. Act 3 is going to be World War III. The Jews of the world, the Zionists, and their co-religionists everywhere are determined that they are going to again use the United States to help them permanently retain Palestine as their foothold for their world government. Now that is just as true as I'm standing here, because not alone have I read it, but many here have read it, and it's known all over the world. Now, what are we going to do? This life you save may be your son. Your boys may be on their way to that war tonight, and you don't know it any more than you knew that in 1916 in London, the Zionists made a deal with the British War Cabinet to send your sons to war in Europe. Did you know it at that time? Not a person in the United States knew it. You weren't permitted to know it. Who knew it? President Wilson knew it. Colonel House knew it. Others knew it. Did I know it? I had a pretty good idea of what was going on. I was liaison to Henry Morgenthau Sr. in the 1912 campaign when President Wilson was elected. And there was talk around the office there. I was confidential man to Henry Morgenthau Sr., who was chairman of the Finance Committee, and I was liaison between him and Rolla Wells, the treasurer. So I sat in these meetings with President Wilson at the head of the table and all the others, and I heard them drum into President Wilson's brain the graduated income tax and what has become the Federal Reserve, and also indoctrinate him with the Zionist movement. And Justice Brandeis and President Wilson were just as close as the two fingers on this hand, and President Woodrow Wilson was just as incompetent when it came to determining what was going on as a newborn baby. And that's how they got us into World War I, why we all slept. Now at this moment, they may be planning this World War III, in which we don't stand a chance, even if they don't use nuclear bombs. How can the United States, about 5% of the world, go out and fight 80 to 90% of the world on their home ground? How can we do it? Send our boys over there to be slaughtered? For what? So the Jews can have Palestine as their commonwealth? They've fooled you so much that you don't know whether you're coming or going. Now, any judge, when he charges a jury, says, gentlemen, any witness that you find has told a single lie, you can disregard all his testimony. That is correct. I don't know from what states you come, but in New York State, that is the way the judge addresses a jury. If that witness said one lie, disregard his testimony. Now, what are the facts? The Jews, I call them Jews to you because they're known as Jews. I don't call them Jews. I refer to them as so-called Jews because I know what they are. If Jesus was a Jew, there isn't a Jew in the world today. And if those people are Jews, certainly our Lord and Savior was not one of them. And I can prove that. Now what happened? The Eastern European Jews, who form 92% of the world's population, of those people who call themselves Jews, were originally Khazars. They were a warlike tribe that lived deep in the heart of Asia. And they were so warlike that even the Asiatics drove them out of Asia into Eastern Europe. And to reduce this, so you don't get too confused about the history of Eastern Europe, they set up this big Khazar kingdom, 800,000 square miles. Only there was no Russia, there were no other countries, and the Khazar kingdom was the biggest country in all Europe. So big and so powerful that when the other monarchs wanted to go to war, the Khazars would loan them 40,000 soldiers. That's how big and powerful they were. Now, they were phallic worshippers, which is filthy. I don't want to go into the details of that now. It was their religion, the way it was the religion of many other pagans or barbarians elsewhere in the world. Now, the king became so disgusted with the degeneracy of his kingdom that he decided to adopt a so-called monotheistic faith, either Christianity, Islam, the Muslim faith, or what is known today as Judaism, really Talmudism.
Mr. Friedman's address will be continued on the second recording, along with a question and answer period between Mr. Friedman and the audience.
Now, the king became so disgusted with the degeneracy of his kingdom that he decided to adopt a so-called monotheistic faith, either Christianity, Islam, the Muslim faith, or what is known today as Judaism, really Talmudism. So, like spinning a top, he said, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and he picked out so-called Judaism. And that became the state religion, and he sent down to the Talmudic schools of Tel Aviv and Surah, and brought up thousands of these rabbis with their teachings, and he opened up synagogues and schools in his kingdom of 800,000 people, 800,000 square miles, and maybe 10 to 20 million people, and they became what we call Jews. There wasn't one of them that ever had an ancestor that ever put a toe in the Holy Land, not alone in Old Testament history, but back to time, the beginning of time. Not one of them. And yet they come to the Christians and they ask us to support their armed insurrection in Palestine by saying, well, you want to certainly help repatriate God's chosen people to their promised land, their ancestral homeland. It's your Christian duty. We gave you one of our boys as your Lord and Savior. You now go to church on Sunday and kneel, and you worship a Jew, and we are Jews. Well, they were pagan Khazars who were converted just the same as the Irish. And it's just as ridiculous to call them people of the Holy Land as it would be. There are 54
So that was an excerpt from a speech from Benjamin H. Friedman, who, as he pointed out, was a former so-called Jew. I want to clarify something, one of the statements that he made, in that the king of the land of Khazar who was King Bulan, he said in the speech that he just basically kind of eeny, meeny, miny, mo chose Judaism from the selection of Islam, Christianity, or Catholicism, and Judaism. But as I pointed out earlier, it wasn't just a random selection. King Bulan, as he was considering the three different religions, and it was those selections that he chose the religion for his kingdom, recognized the fact that the two major powers that existed at that time were controlled by respectively the Muslim Caliphate in Arabia and the Roman Catholic Church in Italy. He wanted his country to be recognized as a power in and of themselves. And as he was considering the different religions, and if you go and read the book, The 13th Tribe by Arthur Koestler, the Muslims sent representatives to King Bulan to convince him to convert to Islam. And indeed, some of the people of the land of Khazar actually did begin to observe Islam. And then he also entertained representatives from the Catholic Church to educate him about their religion as well. And he had the land of Khazar as some of the Judahites began to migrate. They were welcomed into Khazar, and so he was familiar with the Judahite or Phariseeism or Talmudism, because some of those people had moved there, and he had actually befriended some of the priests. And so as he was meeting with the different representatives of the respective religions, he was already familiar with the Judahite or Pharisite religion, which we now know as Judaism. But as he was considering them, it dawned on him that if he were to select Islam or Christianity, Catholicism, that he would be subordinate to the leaders of those respective religions. And so he wanted something to be independent. And so the selection of Judaism, so to speak, was a political decision. It wasn't a decision based upon what he thought was the better religion. It was really a political decision because that kept him independent. And it was a period of time after he selected that religion that it was adopted as a state religion, and then in turn taught exclusively to the citizenry of the land of Khazar. And so, as Friedman pointed out, they were phallic worshippers previously. And then as they began to be educated, they became into, the religion. They began to adopt the Hebrew script and began to learn Hebrew because, of course, that was not their original tongue. And indeed, to this day, the so-called Jews go to Hebrew school to learn Hebrew because that is not their native tongue. Okay. And so we'll leave it there for now. And I'll just go on to say what Friedman was about to lead into was first to go into briefly the history of the Khazars, which we talked about before, to again underscore the nature of the conflict and to establish that the people who are currently the dominant population in the so-called land of Israel and who settled in the land of Palestine and created the state of Israel are not the Judahites who first created the religion back in 458 BC, that they are converts who adopted the religion in 740 AD. And so it is akin to the analogy that I gave last time of you going on vacation and coming back to find someone occupying your home. And when you tell them to vacate, that this is your home, they refuse to vacate the home and will offer you the opportunity to live in the closet upstairs. So that's basically the situation in a nutshell. Of course, you would not accept that deal and would not consider that to be equitable by any means. And you would fight to get your home back, I'm sure. And, so, that basically summarizes the current situation. But there's much more to go into, and I will continue reading to get an even deeper understanding of the topic that I might share with you. Okay, so I hope that you found this to be instructive. I thought it would be good to get a independent source and to hear his words directly to basically underscore that this information has been out there, but has been suppressed, as we will discuss on the next session. And later in the book, Facts Are Facts, he talks about how he experienced persecution himself for bringing this information to pass, and goes into, the why and how it occurred, which brings to mind exactly what happens to this current day when that topic is brought up, or when anyone brings out any kind of information to light, truthful information, factual information about the nature of the control by so-called Jews of the media, the monetary system, and so on. People are labeled as being anti-Semitic, despite the fact that there is good documentation by, even as we read into the record, Jewish quote-unquote sources, which attest to the veracity of those claims. So, with that, I will greet you in the words of the Comedic Word of Peace, Hotep, and thank you for tuning in. And I trust that this information was informative. And again, the books that we used today were the book Facts Are Facts by Benjamin Friedman and The Controversy of Zion by Douglas Reed, which I encourage you to get and read for yourself. So with that, thank you for joining Journey into Self, and we'll see you next time. Hotep.